Welcome to History 2010. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Happy to say that Solomon's not here today to ruin or interrupt the lecture. So, for those of you guys who wanted to have some more of him in your life, you have to go find him. He's in the woods somewhere with my wife. And let me be clear, if you find them, great. You hang out with them. If you bring them back here before they were coming back, we're going to have some troubles, all right? A little peace and quiet here at the house, reading some Federalist Papers this morning because that's who I am. First of all, just a reminder, you got your reading quiz and weekly quiz this week. On top of the lectures from this week, it will cover questions from last week's lectures as well. So just make sure you have your notes ready as you go through. That will be on the quiz description when it posts. That will explain that to you. So if it's right there in front of you, why is it that I would be saying it to you right now? Well, one, because I'm your teacher. It's good for me to remind you of things. Number two, because in the last lecture, I said that I was going to make a Constitution quiz video in which I addressed the most commonly asked questions that I got in emails. Because I said I got a lot of emails, right? And I kind of flipped through them. But I sat down yesterday after I got the lecture posted and was like, all right, let's get through these emails, right? Let's make this video. Let's make sure that everyone understands what's going on. And friends, with the exception of the question that Jenna actually asked last time about impeachment, right? I mean, there was some confusion about the Senate. The Senate tries impeachment, right? They don't actually impeach, which I totally got that confusion. All of the other questions, several emails from people asking me, why did I get this wrong? Why did I get this wrong? With the exception of the question Jenna asked last time, which I did get from a few people as well, every other question was, the quiz asked who elects senators, and I put the people, and I got it wrong. Or the quiz asked, basically, in the quiz I got a question about how old does the Constitution say you have to be to vote. I put 18, but I got it wrong. That's because you didn't see or hear or the thing I said multiple times, which was this was a quiz on the Constitution as of the time that the Bill of Rights was passed. So, and I feel like I was clear. I feel like I clarified this. I almost made a montage video of every time in every lecture that I said that it was on 1791 with screenshots of the actual quiz. Before you took the quiz, you had to read something that said this is on 1791, just a reminder. So make sure you're reading the stuff well, right? I mean, we all slip past things, right? We all make mistakes, but just make sure you're reading the terms, right? Before you answer any question, before you take any quiz, make sure you read the terms. I want you guys to do well and not miss things because of instruction problems, right? Because instruction problems and your actual knowledge are two separate things. Don't let the small thing get in the way of something that you've been building, which is your knowledge. Cool. So, again, a reminder, the midterm exam next week, that will be in your regularly scheduled class time period on either Thursday or Friday at the same time that you would meet for your discussion session. I will be making a video for that soon to explain it. I will also be scheduling a ton of study sessions. You'll have Graham's regular hours, but I cut a deal with the co-owner of our family, my business partner, my life partner, my wife partner, and I have agreed that I'm going to do way more time with Solomon this week to cover her so she can get caught up on some stuff so I can have more free time next week while he's home to do more study sessions for you guys. Cha-ching! So that's it. So we will have plenty of those, and I will post those in the schedule as soon as I get that totally worked out. Again, I'll try to post those as quickly as I can. With the condition of two professors in a house. Condition. It is definitely a condition. Two professors in one house. They're like, yeah, should we surgically remove one? That's too many. But yeah, so I got to kind of like work things out and make sure that her classes are taken care of too, because we're balancing that and balancing other students, and we both really care about them, about you. Actually, she doesn't care about you. Only I do. Only I care about you. No. Oh man, that's like a cult. I'm so bad. This is why I'll never have a cult. Anyway, so all of that. Any questions about the schedule? Cool. All right, let's go on. Last time we met, we talked about ratifying the Constitution. Was it easy? No. Just in Delaware. And why in Delaware? Can anyone tell me why was it so easy in Delaware? Not based on any evidence, but just based on what I assume. Why was it so easy to pass it in Delaware?
Because there's nothing else to do.
excellent, because there's nothing else to do in Delaware. They're still talking about it. It's still on their license plates, the first state, which is not true. They were all states at the same time. Anyway, so also they were states before the Constitution. I don't even know what to tell you, Delaware. Let's not ruin it for them. So we talked about that. We talked about the Federalist versus anti-Federalist debates. The role that Madison and Hamilton played in writing the Federalist Papers. I'll add this. I actually recently added to the extras. You guys notice that every week I have an extras folder, and that's just extra content that's not assigned that is useful for the classes, right? It's kind of, in a way, it's me citing my sources, which I also do in the PowerPoint slides that I post. But just making those available, I added a link to the Library of Congress's. They have like the full text of all of the Federalist Papers online. So if you're interested in reading any of those, it's right there. So we discussed all of that, and when we left off, it was the middle of it was the middle of 1789, and the first Congress and the first government had met in New York. And that's where we left it. Remember, four major issues they had to deal with. 1, writing the Bill of Rights and getting it out. That was going smoothly. 2, defining what the executive branch meant and defining what the judicial branch would do. It's really interesting, something that I've learned recently from Lindsay Chervinsky's book, the Cabinet. It's about Washington's cabinet. It just came out earlier this year. It's fantastic. But I kind of knew this, but she really drives home the point. Washington's cabinet doesn't actually meet until several years into his presidency. He has an attorney general, Edmund Randolph. He has a secretary of war, Henry Knox. He has secretary of state, Thomas Jefferson. And he has secretary of treasury, Alexander Hamilton. But they don't meet until years after the presidency. And one of the reasons for that was because of the idea that a president's cabinet, would look a lot like the cabinets and kind of like the small groups of people back in Great Britain who were affiliated with Parliament. And there was a great fear that those small groups of people meeting and making all these decisions had actually caused a lot of the problems in the American Revolution. So Washington was like pretty hesitant to even convene them to meet. He does a couple years in, but at first he's kind of trying to be more careful about it for lack of fear that, an executive who has this much power forming together with a small group of people may look bad, maybe bad optics. In fact, Washington's really concerned that people will think that he's becoming too invested in himself and too powerful. One of the things Washington does when he's president is he goes on daily walks around the town. He just walks around, out in the streets, just so everyone can see that he's not in a carriage. He's not too good for everybody else. He just walks around. This is before the era where, the era of let's assassinate people so much. We get to that later, so you could do that. That's actually how Garfield ends up getting shot. He's walking around town. This is in 1881. President Garfield gets shot. He's just walking around town, and they're like, there he is. So anyway, at this time, though, Washington could do this, and he did. The two problems that we have left that we could not get through in this first Congress is the 3 and 4 on this list. Where the national capital is going to be located, because remember, the Constitution says there will be a national capital, does not say where it's going to be. And number 4 is the economy and the debt problem. And that's where we left off, and that's where we're going to pick up now. The national capital. The first meeting of Congress takes place in New York City. This is actually a picture here of Federal Hall, which was the building where the first meeting of the federal government actually took place. Where in New York was that building? Well, it was on Wall Street. The first American government under the Constitution met on Wall Street. So, just goes to show, you can take the government out of Wall Street, you just can't get the Wall Street out of government. Am I right? Am I right? Am I right? Oh! Whew. Yeah, I think the audio actually messed up on this. I think what's happening now is because I tried to tell that line about Wall Street, I think that actually the owners of Adobe have a built-in AI that's like delete, delete, delete. It's probably like a survival instinct to save the person who would say something that stupid. So don't worry, I user interference interfaced over it. So, all right. First government meets in New York. Then shortly thereafter, in 1790, they moved to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is where they're going to stay for 10 years. And here's the issue. I mentioned this briefly last time. You would think like there wouldn't be that big of a fight over where the capital was going to be. Or you might think that, right? I mean, there's huge cities. A lot of countries, it's like, well, the capital is like a major city, and the major cities are set up in places where people already live. Like, you might not think it was going to be a big deal, but it is. Because all of the biggest cities and the ones that currently exist that make sense as a national capital, like especially New York and Philadelphia, these two major cities, they're strongholds of the, it's not huge at the time, but they're strongholds of, anti-slavery sentiment. And the Southerners are really worried that they're going to have a capital. First of all, they don't like to travel that far. So, that's a personal issue. But overall, it's the influence thing. And so they're like, we do not want to agree to a northern capital. We realize that we'd be giving away a lot, and further we have to travel when we send our delegates up there. But they've got a problem. The problem is that the southern states don't have like a reasonable, alternative. It's like, what's the biggest city in the South at the time? It's Charleston. Like, just look at a map of the East Coast and ask yourself, if you're going to go to Congress and convince a Congress where most of the senators reside in like New England and New York, right? Because there's all those small states consolidated up there. Ask if you think they're going to vote to have to go to Charleston by boat every time that Congress meets. No way. Philadelphia, New York makes sense because they're central, they're established cities. The Southerners don't have an alternative. So they're basically saying we've got enough power to block naming a capital, but they know they got no leverage to do something about it. So it's kind of, the whole situation is kind of in a deadlock. And that's where they are. On the other hand, and we'll pause there, by the way, and move on to the other problem. This is the debt and the economy. As I've told you guys several times, when we talked about the revolution, getting loans and support from foreign powers and getting people to even invest in the American Revolution on the side of the Patriots, that was an amazing accomplishment. It's outstanding. It's hard to believe they could do it. Remember, I told you guys, it's like walking into a bank and asking for a loan and being like, oh, by the way, most people say that I don't actually exist. And also, if you lend me this money, I'm going to spend it on something that's almost impossible to accomplish. And if I get caught, as I'm probably going to, I'm going to be murdered and then I can't pay you back. It's not a selling pitch. You're not going to win that one on Shark Tank. You're not going to get a bank to invest in that. And everyone knows it. They managed to pull it off. The French come in and support them, both militarily and financially. The Spanish lend money. They get loans from investors inside the U.S. But like all debt, yes, it's great when you can get the loan. That's a step. But people are going to want it back. They're going to want their money back. And the U.S. is a mess. Across the country, you have not just a federal debt, you have state debts. Massachusetts is incredibly in debt. They were like the first place where all this went down, right? Remember the first phase where Bunker Hill, we didn't really talk about Bunker Hill that much, but Lexington and Concord, and then, the Dorchester Heights. Boston was in debt. You have North Carolina's in debt. So, you have all these states, and the states are having trouble paying their debt. As we talked about in Massachusetts, they jack up the taxes to try to pay off the debt, and that forces farmers off their land and causes a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion. So you've got state debts, and then you've got the national debt. And that's a problem across the board because think about this. If you were trying to establish a nation, and you said, all right, we're a nation, this is your national government. And the most direct experience a large portion of the population ever had with that government was that they had been paid in money backed up by the good faith of that government that now was worthless because that government did not back it up. Do you think that you would feel very strongly about that government? Do you think you'd support it? Do you think you'd believe in it? Hell no, you're not going to. And then on top of that, if the country can't pay back its national debt that it has, on top of these states' debts, if it can't pay them back, well, then they're not going to be able to get loans later on if the British come back. Guys, it's a mess. So how the hell are you going to fix this thing? And this is one of the big reasons why so many people said we need a stronger federal government that can do things like tax. Remember, the articles they could ask for taxes, but they couldn't compel states to pay them. Is some way to centralize authority in a way that could actually muster the power to solve these problems, or at least begin to grapple with them. So when it comes time for Washington to appoint a Secretary of the Treasury, it's only one guy on his mind, as I said last time. The only guy that Washington says can fix this is Robert Morris. Robert Morris, who had actually put his own personal credit on the line to secure funding for the articles for the Second Continental Congress. Kind of a genius. This guy, is he's busy, and they're like, Washington's like, dude, I need you, and he's like, nah, I'm good. But he ends up telling to Washington, look, your boy Hamilton is the one that should do this. And this is it's a remarkable story, because Washington was actually not really aware of exactly how trained Hamilton was in finance. He had been reading about it. Like during the Revolutionary War, he's reading like treatises on the economy. He also, as you guys remember, had served as a youth in the import-export firm in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is like a place where the world's people and the world's commerce comes through. And so his formal years, like these years when he's young, he's apprenticed and learns what trade looks like, learns how an international economy works. So he takes his personal education that he has from those years, supplements it with an actual rigorous regime of studying and reading. And Hamilton has an astounding understanding of the global economy. So when Washington pulls him in, it's a really interesting thing, because Hamilton always knew, kind of understood, that while he had the support of the Schuyler family, a powerful family in New York, that he had attached himself, like a lot of his possibilities were attached to Washington. When Washington comes in to run for president, Hamilton works tirelessly to try and make sure that it's Washington who they pick. Honestly, in retrospect, I don't know why he was even worried. It was going to be Washington, but Hamilton he didn't want to take that chance. He worked to get people to make sure that Washington was the one. He then comes in, and the two of them kind of have an understanding. Like, Washington is not an intellectual. Washington is a leader. Washington has incredible judgment, but he's not a theoretician. He doesn't have that side of him like Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and Franklin all have. He's just a guy who's really good at listening and then making the call. So Washington and Hamilton have an interesting understanding. Hamilton's basically like, look, I know that I'm probably not always going to agree with Washington, but there's no way I will ever criticize him publicly, because my fate and his fate are bound. And Washington understands that, and understands that Hamilton, no matter what's done, that Hamilton is going to actually have Washington's interest at heart, because Hamilton's fate is tied to Washington's success. Washington doesn't have that relationship with other people. And it's interesting, because at the time that they're inaugurated, Madison and Jefferson and Washington are far closer. They're all Virginians. But throughout these years, the relationship between Hamilton and Washington is going to get closer and closer. As Ron Chernow says in his Hamilton book, Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury, but if you look at what he did in the Washington administration, you might say today it's also pretty close to being Chief of Staff for the president. Some people have gone so far as to say that the Washington administration could also be called the Hamilton administration, because the two of them work so closely. And what's going to end up happening on this debt plan is that Hamilton comes in and says, I have a plan for how to fix this, but it's going to scare a lot of people. And so he has to figure out how to get support for it. And I'm just going to play for you now a clip from the musical Hamilton. All right, so there you have it. A concise explanation of the debate. Now, let me give you the nuts and bolts of Hamilton's plan because I'll just tell you about it. Okay, so cool. So, the first step is to get Congress to approve taking all of the state debts away from the states, paying the states off so that no states have individual debts, and consolidating all of the state debts and the national debt into one giant debt. This will relieve the types of pressure that caused the taxation that led to Shays' Rebellion. So no longer do you have the fear that the states could be passing policies to keep their head above water that are going to anger the population. Cool. That alone is insane because, I mean, to a lot of people, because it's like, so that's what, like, let me put this in context, okay? So imagine this. Imagine that we're roommates. And together we both have to pay rent. Otherwise, it's going to be bad for both of us. But we're having trouble paying rent because I owe $100,000 on a credit card. So I'm having trouble making ends meet. And then I go, all right, well, I've got a really great investment opportunity I know about. And I come to you as my roommate and I say, sorry, hold on a second. Let me drink some more. All right. And I come to you and I say, I'm going to say that. Frog in my throat. So I come to you and I say, hey, look. I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, but I've got an opportunity. So let's do this. Let's take both of our debts and we'll start a company and we'll get a loan for our company. And that loan we'll use to pay off both of our debt so that we both don't have any debt. And then we can go into business together. All right? And let's say you had $1,000 in debt. Guess what happens when your $101,000 becomes consolidated into one? Now, great news. I don't owe $100,000 anymore. I'm only responsible for $50,500 in debt. But now you, friend, the one who did not run up all that debt, also share it. It's kind of a confusing explanation I'm giving here. That's basically what happened. So start over. So the states are in different degrees of debt. Some have barely any. Now, by making it a national debt, the states are going to be responsible for paying the taxes to pay off the entire debt. And that's going to apply to the states that barely have any debt at all. So that's a fight. But that's the first step for Hamilton's plan. Then after that, here's the following he wants to do. He wants to create a national bank. That's the first part. It's key to this. He wants to create a national bank. Guys, why do you think that a lot of people, even after this debt plan passes, why would people have trouble with a national bank? Why would people be like, nah, 1790? A national bank. Why do you think? I mean, if you think about what we've been learning lately and something you read 3 times last week, you can actually figure this out. Why would people have trouble with it? Somebody unmuted, playing the local 101 jams. All right, so let's see if we can put it this way. You guys read the Constitution, right? And the powers of each branch, we listed them off in discussion session last time, right? And then I explained how the 9th and 10th Amendment work together, but the big one is they both say that the federal government's powers are checked. And it basically says that the federal government's power is limited to what's in the Constitution, okay? So put all that together. And here's the thing. Where in the Constitution does it say that Congress or any branch of the government has the power to establish a national bank? It doesn't. So we are a year into this Constitution where people were terrified of federal power. Now you're talking about consolidating the national debt and then establishing something that is not in the Constitution. Hamilton argues back, and this is going to explain a lot of why the world looks differently now than what you'd think from the Constitution. Hamilton argues back, yes, but Congress has control over basically over the country's finances. It has the power to tax. It's responsible for dealing with the debt. And therefore, since it is given those tasks and those responsibilities, anything it has to do to carry out those responsibilities is an implied power. It's implied. You said we got to do this, so we can't do anything to get there? A national bank is not the end. A national bank is simply a step towards achieving the responsibilities that Congress has vested in it there. You're a year in, and the slippery slope is falling out from underneath you if you are terrified of centralized power. So there's no way at first you can get any support for this. There's no national bank. Aside from that, and this is the best part, do you guys remember what I told you was the big problem that the U.S. had with the economy? They had no money to pay their debts. Did anybody, after knowing that, find it funny that a country that has no money was talking about starting a national bank? I know a lot of you guys aren't business majors in here, but I'll bet that if you ask anybody, you said, all right, what's the number one thing you'll need if you're going to start a bank? I'll bet everybody would be like, probably money. Because that's what banks do, right? Banks make their money off lending money. Like, what are you going to do? People pointed this out to Hamilton. They were like, we're broke. How many of you guys see this? How many of you guys been having trouble paying your rent one month? And you looked at some friends and you were like, guys, look, why don't we start a bank? They would think you were crazy. Okay, so here's what Hamilton says. He goes, people are like, hey, got no money. How you going to start a bank? He goes, don't worry, man. He's like, we're going to sell shares of stock in the bank. People go, who the hell is going to buy shares of stock in a bank that doesn't have any money? Hamilton goes, don't worry about it. We'll have the federal government buy the shares of stock in the bank that doesn't have any money. And they're like, but that was the problem before. That's the reason we were asking where the money was, because the federal government didn't have any money. And now you're telling me that the bank's going to get money by selling shares of stock to the government that doesn't have any money? Like, how the hell is the government going to get money to buy shares of stock in it? And Hamilton goes, don't worry. The bank will lend the money to the federal government to buy the shares of stock in the bank that doesn't have any money, that's going to lend money to buy the... Yeah. Here's what I always think about. All right, when I think about this, I think about how when I was a kid, you guys, these extension cords, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? These extension cords, it turns one into like multiple ones, right? When I was a kid, I was like, hey, I've got an idea. Why don't I just take this thing and plug it into itself? All right, just plug it into itself. Cool. Boom, it's plugged in. And guess what? Now I've got 2 additional plugs, man. Right? And my mom was like, you're not very smart, are you? And I was like, I don't know. It's not working. It didn't work because you can't draw electricity from something that doesn't have electricity. But guys, this is literally, not literally, I shouldn't use that word. But guys, this is the equivalent of doing that, plugging it in, and the light turns on. Because it works. And once they sell a lot of shares to the public, people get invested in it. Okay. The second step, once you've done this insane piece of it, guys, the financial world is so convoluted. And you guys are like, man, banks are just crazy today. It's like, dude, this is like in our DNA. This is the financial system we live in being built by the guy who just pulled that off, or is going to pull it off after a fight. So step 2, we're going to establish a federal mint, basically that prints money that's backed up by the federal government. And here's the plan. Okay, so we now have the debt consolidated. We get a loan from the national bank once it's established. We pay off the debt and we buy up all the currencies that are printed out, all the bonds, every debt. We buy it, we bring it in, and then what we do is we say to the people who hold that debt, we are going to pay you back now, right? So basically we're going to pay you guys all off with long-term instruments that pay interest per year. And we're going to pay this off over 20 years with interest. So essentially, when you pay off that debt out to the states, you put back out currency, or not currency, but security that will only mature over 20 years. So you can't get it all back at once, but you're definitely going to get it and you're definitely going to get interest on it. So what this does is it gives you something now. You just went from having something you thought might be worthless to having something that has a guaranteed value with interest. So suddenly now, maybe you're not the happiest in the world, but you know you're going to get your money back as long as the federal government makes it. In the meantime, though, to keep revenue coming in, Hamilton proposes more taxes, the federal taxes, and a big one is the whiskey tax. Passed an excise tax on whiskey, which is, at this time, you read about it before in an earlier article, but just to remind you, whiskey is essential to people at this time, like the farmers, because it's a way that you can take your grain and turn it into something that does not go bad, something that can be used to barter with other people. You can trade with it. It is essential to a lot of people's households. That's they can't get currency, a lot of them. That's not what's important to them. They have whiskey, and that allows them to trade. So when you're taxing this, you're taxing something that's going to bring in, or should bring in your estimates, good revenue, but also something that's going to hit some people pretty hard and potentially make them mad, which is why in that Hamilton musical, Jefferson says, imagine when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's going to happen when you try to tax their whiskey. Because that's, well, we'll see. Jefferson might have had a point. So this is the plan. There's massive opposition. Again, is it constitutional? The states with no debt or little debt are going to be responsible for larger national debt. And Madison and Jefferson intensely oppose this, as do a lot of people. It's going to bring together a lot of folks in a coherent way that had not necessarily been that way before. But we'll get to that. So, here we're stuck. Southerners want a capital in the South. The primarily Northerners want to have this debt plan worked out. Neither one can get what they want without it. And so, in conditions that we are not familiar with, by legend, a secret meeting that is arranged here, Jefferson comes back from Paris in 1789. He plays, like Madison and Hamilton have been going at it. Jefferson kind of plays, hey, what's going on here, at first. But what he does is he sees this and realizes that maybe there's a way to get past this. And this is the deal, the Compromise of 1790. According to differing accounts that are very vague, Jefferson arranges a meeting for Madison and Hamilton at his own house, in which the two of them, who had become pretty quickly enemies, sit down and they make an agreement. Hamilton says, hey, Madison, I know your boys in the South, they want the capital down there. You know what I want? I want this what's going to be called an act making provision for the payment of debt in the United States. Basically, we call it the Assumption Act, right? To assume all the debts in one. He says, I know what you want, you know what I want. And I think we both have a lot of influence. So how about this? I'll get you the national capital in the South if you get me the votes I need to get my debt plan through. And Madison is in the House. He's in the House of Representatives, incredibly influential, and they strike this deal. We don't know what happened, right? We're not, like the terms, it's kind of a shady thing in American history, but it happens. And on July 16th, the Residence Act is signed into law by President George Washington, which establishes a national capital on the Potomac River, which is the river running between Virginia and Maryland. Architects are then going to begin building Washington, D.C. out of essentially nothing. There was not much of anything there before in terms of settlement. Less than a month later, you have the Assumption Act. This repayment plan passes through Congress August 4th, 1790. And that, friends, is how they get past this moment. And that finally is the reason that they all become friends and there's no more fighting and somebody's not going to shoot each other and another person in a duel, and they're not going to spend the rest of their lives, Jefferson and Madison, trying to destroy Hamilton's reputation. It's all, okay, damn musical, man. It's killing my attention in this class. Anyway, so it gets passed. All right, cool. Now, you remember how I told you that the whiskey was pretty important? You remember how in the cabinet battle you guys watched, Jefferson was like, imagine what's going to happen if they try to tax your whiskey? In March of 1791, they imposed the whiskey tax. Farmers in western Pennsylvania pretty much immediately begin resisting and refusing to pay the tax. Tax collectors who come out and try to collect this tax are attacked by local population. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Did I hear the name Andrew Oliver whispered in the distance? The stamp tax collector in Boston? And don't let this sound like it's, don't think this is out of nowhere. Remember Shays' Rebellion, this rebellion, the people who were standing up against it were like, we're just fighting new tax collectors. We're fighting the people that are taxing us to death without asking us. We're fighting them, losing our land. A lot of those folks see it as the same fight. And that should make sense to you. I mean, we're talking about this point right here. The whiskey tax is imposed, less than 10 years after Yorktown. Less than 8 years after the actual Treaty of Paris. It's in living memory. A lot of these veterans are still there. The revolution's still alive. Revolutions are generational things. These people were of that generation. Washington, again, remember that a lot of these folks are going to be veterans, right? They're going to have fought. They're going to be farmers. They're people that Washington identifies with. Washington cares about unifying the country. Washington tries to get the leaders of a lot of these rebellions to come sit down and talk and try to negotiate. These folks refuse. And this is one of my favorite stories. So after trying to get these resistors to come and sit down and talk, Washington finally says, well, we tried. And he gets Hamilton to put together an army, to raise an army, right? At this time, we don't have a standing army like we have now. We don't have that till after World War II. Basically, says, well, let's handle this. And George Washington, the sitting president of the United States, with Alexander Hamilton, the sitting Secretary of the Treasury, lead soldiers out to go put down this rebellion. They got the band back together. Hamilton and Washington leading at the group of men again. Oh, God bless it. They send them out. Guys, 2 times in American history, 2 times ever, has a sitting president led troops into battle. One time is when Washington leads troops in the Whiskey Rebellion. The second time is in that movie Independence Day where the president gets in a jet fighter and goes and attacks the aliens. Okay, get my point? It only happened one time. The second time was in a movie. Fought aliens in an F-16. But Washington does it because he's like, well, this is what I know how to do. And here's the thing. I don't know, man. You guys heard much about George Washington? He was the commander-in-chief of the group of rednecks that defeated an entire global empire. Yeah, he's the guy that everyone is intimidated by and respects. Maybe I shouldn't have said leads troops into battle, because here's the thing. Washington, when he begins organizing to move that way, when the people who are rebelling against the whiskey tax find out that an army is coming led by George Washington, they run away. They just go, nope, I think we're done with this. Some of them run to Canada. Think about that. How bad would things for you have to be for you to move to Canada? These guys were like, we're going to Canada. We can't even come back in this country. The father of our nation's coming to get us. But guys, don't think about this as something separate from Shays' Rebellion. Don't think about this as like, wow, a random rebellion. This is more of the same. This is the same sentiment as Shays' Rebellion. These folks crafted this new government in the hopes that they could get past this. And now these rebellions ends in October of 1794, but you're talking 11 years after independence is secured and still the same problems. It's not looking good. At the end of this, in spite of perhaps getting people settled in Kentucky, what you see is the persistence of unrest. Things are not settled. But on the plus side, you guys remember I told you that just after the end of the Revolutionary War, like the state of Franklin declared independence from North Carolina and was like, we're our own state now. And Vermont had done that as well. And the federal government could do nothing about it. Well, what I just told you was they tried to negotiate with these folks. But at the end of the day, the U.S. government was able to put together an army and send it out there to put it down. So on that hand, you see that the federal government has the strength. Another thing to think about, going back to the tax plan, something that I should have brought up before, but actually makes sense now. So you see the durability there. You see the ability of the government to put these down. But another reason that there's criticism of Hamilton's plan is the idea that Hamilton is trying to build a strong federal government. Think about this. Remember I told you that they're raising money from the whiskey tax, right? Because they're gonna bring in more money, and they have other taxes as well. But they've paid people off in long-term securities. Think about this. If you are owed money by the federal government and they give you a 20-year bond or 20 years of security of some type, what happens if that government collapses in 5 years? What happens? Anybody? Anybody here own any Confederate dollars? Confederate money was everywhere when I was a kid, man. You used to be able to buy it. I don't know how, because they churned it out. All right, I'm just going to tell you, it ain't worth anything because the governments that backed it up collapsed. And then the 14th Amendment actually annuls all Confederate debt. Nobody ever pays attention to that part of it. Owning security in a company that collapses means you lose your entire investment. This is the genius part of Hamilton's plan, is that now he's united people from across the country into one interest group. Those who want to see the federal government exist long enough to pay them back at least, which means that people across the country who might not care now have a personal interest in seeing that federal government succeed. There's another reason why there's unrest into the 1790s, and this gets into a big fight that actually happens, and it's pretty significant. So remember I told you that the Continental Congress paid soldiers back, paid them in currency called continentals, right? These continental currency that they could not back up afterwards. Well, when it comes to paying back and making good on all of the debt that the states and the federal government has and rolling them into these new bonds or these new securities, the question is, what do you do about those folks? Because the plan is, if you're taking all the debt, remember a dollar, right? Any type of paper currency is a promise. It's a promise that you'll make good on to deliver in goods or back up that currency. And you'd think that your average poor farmer that was a veteran of and had been paid in this forever ago, you'd think that they would be really excited about this plan because finally the promise that the government made to them would be made good and they would get that pay and it would be worth something. And for the very small number of people who still had that currency, sure. But the problem is that these farmers like in Shade's Rebellion and these other groups, they were desperate. So when the currency was worth nothing, the majority of them sold their currency off to speculators, financial speculators, who bought that currency for pennies on the dollar. To a lot of those folks, it looks awfully suspicious that when the farmers and the soldiers had the money, that the federal government won't go do anything about it. But once it all gets in the hands of the bankers in the cities, and once all the speculation houses have it, suddenly we're making good on it 1-to-1, even better with interest. This angered a lot of people. And this was another fight that, it doesn't make it into the musical really, but, it's a pretty intense disagreement that happens between Madison and Hamilton about this. Because Madison says, we should find out who this money was paid to and reimburse them, not the speculators that took advantage of them. We should find the soldiers. We've got the payrolls. Anyone who doesn't deliver on that money, we could possibly cross it off. I mean, there's, it's really hard to imagine how you do it, but Madison says we should at least do something for those soldiers, for those veterans. And Hamilton says, no, I'm not doing that. Number one, because the logistics of figuring that out would be overwhelming. But number two, and this is one of the reasons why people hate Hamilton. Number two, those folks made a deal. This is about contracts. The people who bought it up on speculation, they paying pennies for something that may have been worth nothing in the end. At least the veterans got something out of it. This is the way it works. It's a contract. It's a deal. Hamilton has this spirit about him, and it makes a lot of people who are more passionate angry because he's very calculated about it. He does the same thing with the British. Hamilton actually defends British property owners who lost property during the Revolutionary War and fled. And people are like, you're going to defend the British? And he's like, look, under the rules of law, like under, in war, they were destroyed and we're obligated to pay them back. So even if they're our enemies, then we'll do it. So this is one of the reasons that Hamilton is constantly kind of made out like a bad guy, because he follows like this code of like kind of calculation, but it doesn't always go with popular sentiments. In the end, the veterans don't get paid back. I wish I could say that in our nation's history, this was a singular event in which people who fight for our country are not given what they've, in a sense, actually very fully agreed to risk their lives for. But it's not. It's one of the ironies sitting right in front of our faces is that everybody likes to take pictures of veterans. Everybody likes to put ribbons on their cars and tell everyone how much they love veterans. But when it comes time to actually pay and return the promise that we made to them, I don't know. It's my personal opinion, but we could do better. It's in our country's DNA in a way. Going back to these folks, the ones who were paid in worthless currency, risked their lives, walked away from their families, left them there, came back to be taxed, lose their land, a lot of them. Yeah. And hell, the black one's just written out of history. So, now, actually, before I go on to this next slide, I want you guys to all just do, I love doing this, all right? I want you all just to close your eyes with me for a second, okay? Okay? You guys got this? I've got my eyes closed, all right? I'm going to tell you something. When this country was established, and the first government met, there were no political parties. There were none. There were groups that would get together strongly on an issue, like the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, for example. They would fight for a principle, but they didn't have to agree on everything. They'd make the decision to join a formal party. Can you guys just breathe? The basis of the debate was that people would form together to support an issue or a cause or a policy, and that was what they were for together. Ah, doesn't it feel good? Even just saying it. Sorry. As it turns out, my political biases are hyper unpolitical, I guess. I don't know. But, well, guys, don't close your eyes for too long because it didn't last. In the 1790s, the fights that are happening between Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson, these lay the foundation for the first political parties. The origins of this have to do with concern over federal power like everything else. Some of the masterminds behind them, sitting right under your eyes, General Washington, President Washington. Two of the conspirators are right there with you. Jefferson and Madison, your old friends. They're tired of all the support. Every time these guys argue, Jefferson and Hamilton bring up different positions on an issue, and it just seems like every time Washington decides to go with Hamilton. There's a debt plan. Washington supports that. The French Revolution is happening. If you guys want to go to Hamilton and check out Cabinet Battle Number 2, it discusses what to do. The French Revolution breaks out, and the U.S. has to determine what we're going to do. How are we going to get involved? Are we not going to get involved? Remember, we're still weak. We're still broke. And the French are having a revolution, and it looks like there's going to be a war with Great Britain. What is the U.S. going to do? Is it going to throw in with the French and say, we support your revolution because you supported ours? Or are we going to step back and not get involved for fear that our entire country could fall apart, giving the British an excuse to come after us and whip our biggest allies at the same time, allies from the Revolution? On that issue, Washington sides with Hamilton. Again, Hamilton says stay out of it. Side note, it is a deep irony, and this is Sarah Vowell pointed this out really well in Lafayette and the somewhat United States. A deep irony that a country that was based on no taxation without representation borrowed and took a lot of money from a country that was ruled by a monarch that was taxing the hell out of his people in France, while the people got more and more desperate. So we're like, no taxation without representation. We're for liberty. Hey, King of France, could you loan us some money? We're friends, right? Well, the borrowing pattern of the French monarch lead to beheading, lead to a revolution. At first, the revolution starts off kind of like ours on the same principles. Marquis de Lafayette, who's back over there, writes this Declaration of the Rights of Men. It's an Enlightenment-style revolution, political revolution. Then the French Revolution begins to keep going to a full-scale revolution. A lot of revolutions in the world, guys, are bloody, particularly ones against monarchies, because the basis of the monarchy is bloodline. So the best way to get rid of their legitimacy is to murder them and their entire family, thus cutting off the end of the bloodline. Right? They kill King Louis and Marie Antoinette in France. That's one of the reasons the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution killed the Tsar and their entire family in a basement in Siberia, is to murder every single one of them to make sure there's no one that can claim the throne. The French Revolution goes to this phase. You kill the king and the queen. It pushes further. You guys ever heard of the guillotine? You guys ever heard of the guillotine? You guys ever heard of the guillotine? Oh, man. High times for the guillotine in France in these years. People start turning on each other. Jefferson's like, we've got to support their revolution. And Hamilton's like, they're cutting heads off. We didn't. That's different. Washington sides with Hamilton. Jefferson, who helped Lafayette, got to be friends with him in France, feels betrayed. So under all this pressure and the sense that the federal government's going too strong, Madison and Hamilton take a little break from their jobs. They say they're going on a business trip. They go out of town and they recruit a newspaper editor to come back to town and start the National Review, a newspaper that is set up in Philadelphia with the specific purpose of slandering and attacking George Washington and his policies, and Hamilton. This is going to be one of the reasons why Washington realizes he needs to stick around to try to work things out. He's not aware of exactly what goes on at the time with this. But once Washington sees what's happening and realizes that these guys are behind it. He feels incredibly betrayed, deeply betrayed. From Washington's perspective, he never wanted to be president. He didn't want to do it. He did it because he was called to serve. And he made hard decisions all the time, hard decisions that he knew were going to make people angry. But he thought about him, and he cared, and he tried to make a good decision. And now this newspaper making all these attacks, once he realizes that it's his former friends and fellow Virginians behind it, it's very hurtful. They also work to organize groups of farmers across the country, and there's so many people involved in this. But they bring them together essentially to create what is called the Democratic Republican Party. I know that is confusing. It is not related right now, it does not go back to either of the two major political parties. This party is going to kind of die off in the 1820s. But they form these parties that are based on smaller government, and that essentially sparks Hamilton and John Adams and others to join together in creating a bit of a looser party, but nevertheless one with similar, with the same kind of like party mentality. The Federalists, not the same Federalists as during the constitutional ratification debates. Madison was a Federalist then. Now he's a Democratic Republican. Remember, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, positions on an issue. Federalists, Democratic Republicans, good old-fashioned slandering, shit-talking political parties. All right, cool. Got it? There we go. Did he just say a bad word? Yeah, I did. Now you remember it. They're parties, all right? So, there you have it. And this is going to spark fierce debates. Washington oversees this whole thing. And after 8 years in office, or 7 years in office, really, Washington decides it's time to step down. By some accounts, he had only planned to serve for 2 years. By his own accounts, we don't know how much he meant it, right? But he said he would like to have served 2 years early on. He ends up serving out his first term. He's reelected in 1792. He comes back because he feels like he needs to do that to serve the country. But he's getting old. He wants to go home, but he sticks around. This is his MO. I signed you his first inaugural address, which by the accounts of people who watched it, it looked kind of clunky because Washington stood up there and kind of read it and didn't speak in his regular tradition. But the sentiment's what matters. In this, he says to everyone, look, I am honored. I would not have done this if you had not called me to do it. I will give it everything I've got, and I'm not sure that I can do it. Plans to retire after one term. He even has a farewell letter drafted, ready to go, to tell everyone that he's leaving office after the first term. Washington, not the penman, right? Washington has the ideas of his own, but he's not a writer, in the compelling way that you would want someone to write at the time. So in that first administration, when he thinks he's going to retire at the first term, he goes to the person who's a great writer that he's close with. He goes to James Madison, and James Madison writes and drafts a farewell address that's ready to go. And then Washington decides to stick around. And he realizes Madison, Jefferson have turned on him. But he's become closer than ever with Hamilton. For Washington, so much of what he does as the president draws on his experience as commander-in-chief during the American Revolutionary War. And Hamilton's there with him, the guy that was his aide-de-camp during the war. The guy that served alongside with him and never criticized him, stayed loyal to Washington. And not loyal like in the sense that it's like whatever you do is fine, but stuck with him, right? Helped him make good decisions. And the guy who never went out there and slandered his name, even though everyone kind of had the sense that Hamilton thought he was smarter and probably should be doing the job. It's like the one person that Hamilton could swallow that with and actually back up and play a team game with. So when Washington decides to leave after the second term, and remember, there's no term limits at this time, he chooses to step down. he decides to draft a new farewell address, and this time he turns to Hamilton. If you haven't already read it, it's a sign for this week. It's Washington's farewell address. It's published in the newspapers to announce to the country that Washington's time in office is done. He leaves some really important wisdom to us. I think this is one of the great documents in American history. It's Washington's thought coming out of an entire lifetime of service to the country. This man is a forerunner in thinking about the United States as a real thing, risking his life for it and sacrificing himself for it. And he leaves some things that are more relevant to the time, other things that I think transcend in really powerful ways. But nevertheless, it's an account. It's a testimonial of a man who has served. And I think with as close as we could get to the best intent. As I said before, what revolution ends with the main military commander, the one leader who leads them through it? What revolution ends with that person on their own choice, just walking away from power and passing to future generations that tradition of a peaceful transition of power? If you've ever seen a presidential inauguration, you hear the platitudes. Oh, peaceful transition of power. Peaceful. I can hear people say it, and I can tell a lot of them in their voice, it doesn't seem like they really appreciate that or understand that. But it's massive. When did Fidel Castro transfer power? Death. When did Napoleon transfer power? Complete defeat. When did Stalin transfer power? Death. When did Mao Zedong transfer power? Death. Our guy just wanted to go home. That's a blessing. And he left behind the wisdom. And in it, there's some pretty remarkable insight. Number one, he says to Americans, believe that you can stick together. Believe that we can be one country. There was a lot of doubt at the time. Because as I said before, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, this book that shaped so many people's notions about democracy, one of the conclusions was that Rome had gotten too big, and that's what caused it to fall. And Washington says this country can persist. Even though it's expanded, it can expand and it can remain strong. We don't need to believe that it will fall apart and break into smaller sections. There's two really crucial parts of this that I want to that are in there that just, it almost feels like if you read this coming from someone knowing what happened, it feels like almost like a prophecy in a way. It's not. It's just wisdom. Number one, Washington says, stay out of foreign engagements. You're going to find yourself whipped up and fighting somebody else's war. You're going to lose track of building at home, and you're going to focus on what's happening abroad. And while Washington was someone that completely believed in good foreign relations, right, and believed that you had to fight a war when one had to be fought, he said if you can avoid getting caught up in other people's wars, take care of your home. The second one, which is the one that is just kind of flooring. Washington never joined a political party. Even the second time he ran nonpartisan. People considered him a Federalist because he went along with most of their policies, but he was not a partisan person. And what he says in this letter is, I have seen these parties constructed right in front of me. I have seen what they have done to the country. They have not been good. The party system has replaced debate over ideas with symbols and loyalty. And that if we don't stop this, at the end of the day, this country is going to cease to be one that focuses on virtue, that focuses on the best ideas, that focuses on reason, and is going to split into a divided place where people follow symbols and leaders and not ideas. The guy who all of you, when you walked in here, into this class, you knew he mattered. He's evoked all the time in American politics today. And when he walked away from a life of service, he left us wisdom that it seems like we must have never heard. You can make statues of people. You can put people on money. You can paint people and hang paintings all over the place. You can evoke their image all you want. But if you don't know their words, why are you doing it? This is why I love teaching history. To remind us that in our past are amazing ideas and great leaders, and that there was at a time lots of great reasons why these folks were held up as a model of leadership. It's just remembering the person and not the image that matters. When people read Washington's farewell address, people cried. People were heartbroken. At every turn from the beginning of the revolution to that point, when something seemed like it couldn't be done, Washington did it. He led the Continental Army through a brutal war. He stayed on the field with his soldiers. Did not see his house for 6 years. The war ended, and he won. Who thought that could happen? And when they won, he was commander-in-chief, and he just handed over his commission and went home. Who thought that could happen? And when he was happy being at home and they needed help getting legitimacy for a constitution, he agreed to show up and sit at the front of the room to be the president of the convention. And he watched them construct a job that he did not want right in front of him. And then he took it. When the Whiskey Rebellion happened, he helped put that down. When the Newburgh Conspiracy happened, he helped put that down. And now this guy is saying goodbye. He will return home, live just a few more years before he passes away, leaving this country in the hands of all of the maniacs that made him stay the president longer. But if you're grateful, read his words. And you know what? Even if you're not, read his words, because I assigned them this week. They'll be on the quiz. I'm Dr. Sawyer. Have a great day. Be grateful for what you got. Thanks.